Welcome to the Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, what are we talking about today?
Well, so today we're starting those show-specific episodes to kind of give this series some structure. We're going to call this The Tonys on Tour. I really like that.
I do too.
Kristin came up with that. I was like, that's awesome. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to feature the Tony Award winning.
I think you mean winning.
Yes, best musicals that are currently on tour or about to be on tour in the U.S. And so that's kind of how this will start. So we're going to start with The Wiz.
That's exactly right. So we're doing these in chronological order. What I did was I looked at what's currently touring the U.S. I pulled out those that have won Best Musical, and then I just listed them in chronological order. You know, we could have gone alphabetical. We could have gone chronological. I went chronological because I was very interested in The Wiz at the moment. So I wanted to start there, which of course won Best Musical in 1975. So this series of episodes are going to include shows like I mentioned, Annie, to Les Mis, to Hamilton, to Kimberly Akimbo, and we'll get started obviously with The Wiz, which is today's topic. So now, while the 1984 and 2024 revivals of The Wiz didn't win Tony Awards, the 1975 original production took home 7 Tony Awards on 8 nominations. And of course, it won Best Musical, which is what plugged it into this list that we're working on now. The Tonys on tour.
That doesn't happen. 7 out of 8 nominations.
It's like unbelievable.
That's a really big deal.
And we're going to get more into why. I mean, it didn't get the greatest reviews throughout its tryout period. You know, then after it opened on Broadway, they were ready to close, in fact. So we'll get into what saved that show and how it was really just the popularity that drove some of the excitement, the popularity of the show. But we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So now I just want to remind you, in case you haven't seen or listened to earlier episodes, these micro histories that we're going to be doing of these productions are really how I launched the Dr. Broadway business. I was doing talks like this before performances of musicals at theaters across the Southeast, and that kind of took off for me. And I began to think, you know, I feel like more people could benefit from hearing this information before they go to see a show. But unfortunately, I can only drive so far in a few hours time, right? Yeah. So I thought, you know, maybe there is another way that I can get this access out to, or I can get this information out to people.
What's the longest you've ever drive?
Oh gosh.
I have a PhD, just so you know.
Let's see. The longest for well, I've driven from Anderson, South Carolina to Knoxville, Tennessee and back. And that was probably a 5-hour.
That was 5 hours.
That was probably my longest.
Indiana to Muncie, Indiana to Washington, D.C., it took us 10 and a half hours. To do one, and then the next day we turned around and came back home.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, then
sometimes you can't do that anymore.
No,
guys, I am too old to do that anymore, so we have to do it on a podcast.
Well, and also I'm getting more and more concerned about the amount of mileage on my car. You know, you're getting old.
We are getting old.
You're like, well, this is going to hurt the resale value.
Yeah. Anyway,
gotta be careful about that. So, you know, that's why the idea of a podcast had been percolating in my brain. And then Tracey came along and it had percolated in hers as well. And the great thing about Tracey is that she knew how to take it from our brains to the World Wide Web. And so that's why we have this podcast going. But at any rate, these are the sorts of things that if you were to come and hear me speak at a theater, you would hear. And the great thing now is that we have Tracey coming alongside, plugging in the sorts of information that she really thrives at. And that is putting in the context of what was happening either in the larger culture or on Broadway specifically, and musical theater specifically. And then, you know, I'll talk about nuts and bolts of the show being developed, but she'll come around and say, okay, but here's how that fits into the larger world around it. Because as we've discussed, theater doesn't happen in a vacuum. Yeah. So the goal is that with these episodes, these micro history episodes, starting with the Tonys on tour, that if you're going to see The Wiz or any of these other shows at a theater near you, you can download this episode before you go, and you'll go in knowing where, when, how the show came to be. In other words, as the tagline goes, educating theater goers and enhancing theater going. So, Tracey, with that said, kick us off.
So as part of this contextualization, what we want to do is kind of take you, I want to do about 5-6 minutes. Hold me to that. That just kind of walks through, again, a little bit of the timeline to remember where we've been, and what gets us to The Wiz. One thing that I will say ahead of time is that African-American musical theater, I usually do on a separate timeline than my normal musical theater history timeline. And I do that for 2 reasons. And that was kind of a decision that was made in classes with a lot of my African-American students' input. At one point, we thought we should collapse it all together and do it all at the same time. And while I think that would be a totally rational way of doing it, one of the things that had been said over and over and over again was like, it doesn't really show how starkly it comes and goes and is suppressed in some places. So I do it kind of outside itself. So I have kind of like its own little timeline out here. So where do we see African American musical theater kind of, get going and get moving? Well, we have minstrelsy, which starts as kind of an all white musical theater form, but as it develops and as it grows, it enters into it actors that are African American who are blacking up with cork on their faces and actually performing in this. And there's quite a few of those actors as well. And then that just kind of goes away. And we don't see a lot of African American kind of representation in any of the forms that we're looking at. In the 1920s and 30s, with the rise of the Harlem Renaissance, we also see a lot more of kind of this inputting of Black shows into especially the kind of Broadway drama scene and musical theater itself. So if you look at things like Shuffle Along, which was 1921, U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel, that's really where we start seeing a huge explosion where we have an all-Black musical on Broadway. It's followed up by something called like Running Wild, which is the first musical to feature the Charleston. Go figure. But this is done at the same time as playwrights such as Willis Richardson, who writes The Chipwoman's Fortune. And then we see the rise of lots of these African-American theater companies like the Krigwa Players and the Harlem Experimental Theater and the American Negro Theater that comes up in the 1940s. These are all major kind of players in bringing African-American representation to Broadway. Broadway being kind of a generalized term for everything. And then it kind of goes away again. Yeah. And then we start seeing in 1935 a rise of what I call the black-white musicals or the white-black musicals. We see things like Porgy and Bess, totally written by a white man, George Gershwin, yeah, right. Written by a white guy. Everybody is on the creative team is white. Everybody in the cast is Black. And we see that over and over again. I mean, you keep going back to like Carmen Jones, which Hammerstein does. Cabin in the Sky, Stormy Weather, St. Louis Woman, Lost in the Stars. Major musicals that are kind of purported to be about the Black experience, but are being kind of harnessed by white artists behind the scenes. We can talk more. There's a lot of things that you can talk about there about whether what's really the issue here. If you look at Hammerstein, one of the things that Hammerstein says is, I've got all of these talented people and we need a show for them. Right? I mean, and that's what he does with Corman Jones. He's like, this is ridiculous. We need to get these people on stage, and it's like, okay, so there's that shuffle back and forth, right? There's nothing that it's just a little bit of one hand in and the other hand out kind of moments. The other thing is during the 1930s, we see the Federal Theater Project that comes up, and we've got to do a whole episode on the Federal Theater Project, obviously, at some point.
Making a note.
But there's an entire and quote unquote Negro unit. It's called the Federal Theater Project Negro Unit, which starts acting in production schools for Black artists. Starts kind of creating its own art and sending it out on tour. It actually does better financially than the Federal Theater Project that's running concurrently at the same time, because equity rules say that at that point, Black artists are cheaper to hire at that point, so they don't have to pay them as much. And therefore, what we have is something where they like fully outstrip the Federal Theater Project as we know it over here, because they're actually ending in the black, which is like, anybody who knows anything about the Federal Theater Project, they're always begging for money. They're like, we don't have any money. What are we doing? So there's a major show there called The Swing Black Mikado, which is kind of a spoof basically on the Gilbert and Sullivan Mikado that apparently was fantastic. I have been for years trying to track down some semblance of the script, can't do it, but apparently it was just the most successful thing that anybody in the Federal Theater Project had ever seen. It broke all the receipt records in 1938. So we have those kinds of things happening, and then again, it kind of goes away again, and it's like that's the issue. You can kind of go back and forth and back and forth. We see a resurgence of it again with the Black Arts movement, and specifically in drama that's pointed towards civil rights. The Black Arts movement itself, just so interesting, and kind of how it's trying to kind of have that larger discussion and using theater to have a larger discussion about the Civil Rights Act as it kind of moves through Congress and moves through our society at large. But one of the major names there, Langston Hughes, obviously, were hit with his version of The Barrier and Simply Heavenly, and his Black Nativity and Tambourines for Glory and Jericho, Jim Crow. He is the drama voice for that. This is also the time that we have A Raisin in the Sun. And if you know anything about some of these shows, these are very... they are activist in nature. They are meant to get people to think. They are meant to get people to have to have that discussion that is happening all over the United States in the late 50s and early 60s about civil rights and what that means. That's a historical fact right there. So, post the Civil Rights Act, we do see a lot. Post the Civil Rights Act, what we see is kind of a lessening of Black representation on Broadway necessarily. What we do see is a lot of building of small Black companies, as well as theater spaces kind of all over the country, like Bart's, the Free Southern Theater, the Negro Ensemble Theater, and the New Lafayette Theater, as well as the National Black Theater. These are, major voices for trying to bring African-American experience to audiences. Very much about the anti-well-made play, trying to... They use this time in the 60s to really kind of assess storytelling as it is, and saying, is the storytelling that's being done on our stages, does that come from us? Or is that a white construct that we probably could do something different with? And so there's a lot of discussion about that, using the improvisation and folklore and call and response rather than this or not the but the well-made play that we've come so much to use in Western culture. So there's not a lot going on in Broadway, especially when it comes to the musical. What there is during this time, which is really funny, the Black arts movement has doing so much work, but there's not really any musicals. There's this one little all-Black production of Hello, Dolly with Pearl Bailey and Cab Calloway. And that enters us into The Wiz.
Yeah, that's a great context, great background, because it will tell you. I'm going to talk in just a moment about the producer of The Wiz, the man who came up with the idea. His name was Kenneth Harper. And so exactly what Tracey is talking about there is what he had been percolating in, right? That was the zeitgeist that he grew up in and around. He was born in the Bronx, so he had grown up, surrounded by this arts movement in New York in particular. So that's really, really helpful information to have. And in just a minute, I'm going to get back to that all-Black production of Hello, Dolly. But I want to start off, because we're talking about The Wiz, with that original source material. Because believe it or not, it was not the 1939 MGM movie starring Judy Garland, right? It wasn't that. In fact, we'll talk about why it wasn't that in just a moment. But of course, the source material for The Wiz was a book, right? A book that had been published in 1900 by a man named L. Frank Baum. Now, L. Frank Baum had done a little bit of everything in his career. He'd been an oil tycoon, although not a very successful one. He'd been a shop owner. He'd had tried his hand at running a newspaper and writing for a newspaper. He had tried to be an actor or a salesman or a chicken breeder. He reminds me a lot, if you do know that 1939 Wizard of Oz movie, as of a character that we see very close to the beginning, who is a snake oil salesman, essentially, who's just trying to make a buck, doing whatever he can do to make a buck, right? That's kind of what L. Frank Baum's biography reads like. Well, finally, by the time he's in his 40s, he sort of settles in, he finds his niche, right? He moves with his family to Chicago, and he starts writing children's books. And one of the first that he wrote was published in 1897. It was called Tales from Mother Goose. And it sold reasonably well enough that the publishing company said, you know what else have you got? So he wrote Father Goose, his book. So we see, let's turn this on its head and hear from, if there's a Mother Goose, there's got to be a Father Goose. So let's hear from him. Well, that book sold 60,000 copies, which I would imagine was a pretty successful book, right? In 1899. And really what he wanted to do, now that he discovered this, maybe I'm not an oil tycoon, maybe I'm a children's author. What he wanted to do was to come up with his own kind of, Marvel universe, right? He wanted to write his own fairy tales, like Mother Goose, like he'd already written. He wanted to be the new Brothers Grimm or the new Hans Christian Andersen. That's the sort of thing that he wanted to develop, this sort of complete, what's the word that I'm looking for? I keep thinking Marvel universe because that's in our zeitgeist, right? But that's what he wanted. This whole alternate reality is what he was looking to create. And he really liked Lewis Carroll's book, Alice in Wonderland. So he decided, you know what? I'm going to write about my own little girl heroine and her experiences in this fictional world that I'm going to create called Oz.
Are you
and
serious?
So
oh,
what's
my
that?
Goodness.
Yes.
That
Believe
never
it or not.
occurred to me, the relationship between that and Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
You're right.
That was
oh my
his,
gosh.
Yeah, I know, right? That was his jumping off point. He just loved that character and thought, I'm going to write my own little girl. And like I said, I think it's so interesting when you understand that he didn't set out to write one book. He wanted to have his own universe, right? He wanted it, and this was his. It was an intentional from the very beginning. I want it to be this whole alternate reality. And then we see with the success of that first book, which came out in 1900, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, it sold out. It was first printing was 10,000 copies, and it sold out like that, lickety split. So eventually It sold more than 3 million copies before it entered the public domain in 1956. It also spawned 13 sequels. So there is, if you look through the list of books that he's wrote, it's like The Scarecrow of Oz, The Tin Man of Oz, Dorothy of Oz, right? Yeah. There's definitely a pattern here, but these books are coming out every so often and they're very popular. The character of Dorothy, of course, we have a whole lot of little girls named Dorothy around that time, including one who's near and dear to my heart, which is Dorothy Fields, who was born in 1904 and named Dorothy because of this character. But there's a lot of Dorothys in the world because of this character, not just Dorothy Fields. But so there were 13 sequels that he wrote. Then after his death, others took up the mantle and continued writing stories about Oz. So truly, if he wanted to create his own alternate reality, his own Marvel universe, mission accomplished, right? Yeah. He did that in spades. So he wrote 13 sequels. He also adapted The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, that 1900 original story, into a 1903 play for which he wrote book and lyrics. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this in a little bit, that play premiered at the Majestic Theater. And Tracey, listen to this. It ran for almost 300 performances in 1903.
Wow.
Can you believe
huge.
That?
No.
What's interesting to me, and this is not the place for this conversation, but it is interesting to me to think about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and Peter Pan. So two iconic children's stories are both hitting the stage, I think exactly the same time. Peter Pan might have been 1902. It might have been slightly before, but nevertheless, it was revived every year for decades. It's so interesting to me that these super successful children's iconic stories are born at this same time. And I don't know if there's any overlap there or not, but that would be interesting to dig into. I just haven't done that work. But at any rate, it runs for 300 performances, which is unbelievably long. We've alluded to the hows and whys of why shows didn't run that long back then. So to go for 300 performances is enormous. Yeah. Then in 1904, the year Dorothy was born, which is what inspired her name, or my Dorothy Fields, it was revived in 1904 and ran for another nearly 200 performances. So this story
on Broadway, not on tour.
On Broadway. This was on Broadway at the Majestic Theater. Yes. It's unreal, isn't it? And Baum, like I said, wrote book and lyrics for these adaptations. There were then 6 different filmed versions prior to the 1939 MGM version. That was the 7th. So there were this story not only took off in book form and on stage, but there were multiple films made of it. Baum himself filmed 4 of the 7. Just enormous success, right? So that's the background about The Wizard of Oz. Then, like I said, it entered the public domain in 1956, and that's going to become an important piece of this story here in just a minute. So I mentioned Kenneth Harper, the producer, the idea man, the guy who said, I think we need to make a story using Black creators to tell the story of The Wizard of Oz. That man was named Kenneth Harper. And like I said earlier, he was born and raised in the Bronx. So he grew up around New York City. He was accepted into Columbia University to further his studies, still near home in New York, but decided instead that he would join the military. And that really was a life-changing choice for him. He was a DJ for the Armed Forces Radio. And when he came back from being in the armed services, rather than, go back to school, he decided instead that he would become a DJ at a New York radio station, WPIX FM. So there he did the overnight DJ. He had a show called Manhattan After Hours for several years, and he was really, really popular. Of course, music became very important to him through that process, and he eventually became the music and public affairs director for the station. So it was during this time, while he was working at WPIX, playing, first Manhattan After Hours, DJ, and then as public affairs director for WPIX, that he saw the all-Black version of Hello, Dolly, as you mentioned, with Pearl Bailey in the title role, and then Cab Calloway. Now, this was 1967 that this happened on Broadway. And when he saw that show, of course, that show had not been created on its own. It was really an attempt by David Merrick, producer extraordinaire, impresario, in the mold of Florin Ziegfeld. It was really his attempt at, kind of giving a punch in the arm to Hello, Dolly, which had premiered in, I believe, 1964, right? And starred Carol Channing. It was really his attempt at saying, hey, let's try it again and we'll breathe some new life into this show that's been running for several years and see what happens, right? And it was a massive, massive hit. It was a huge, huge hit. Well, when he saw that show, Kenneth Harper, working at WPIX, thought, wait a minute. I think I'm going to come up with an all-black show of my own. Why not, right? Now, remember, music, because he'd been a DJ for so many years, had become very, very important to him. So he knew that whatever show he did, he wanted it to be a musical. And so originally he thought that he would produce a TV special, right? That was his initial vision, was I'm going to do something. He envisioned Melba Moore as Dorothy, Pearl Bailey, I guess, because she had been connected with Hello, Dolly, but he originally envisioned her as the Wicked Witch of the West. He saw Bill Cosby, who was, at the beginning stages of his career in the mid 1960s. He saw him as the Tin Man, and he tried to sell this story to a television network, but no one wanted it. Can you think of why? Do you have any ideas as to why no one wanted it?
Was this the 1970s or the end?
This was been around the late 60s, yeah.
I don't know right off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, but they all said you can't compete with the movie, right? Nobody's going to believe these black actors.
Oh, really? They're still talking about the 39 movie?
Yes.
Oh
They
gosh.
said it cannot compete with the 1939 film. Yeah, believe it or not.
So at that point, the film is still making so much money,
royalty-wise. Oh, no question.
They don't want anything to, that says something as well. Just about how The Wizard of Oz is so, ingrained in our national psyche. That is
unbelievable.
Very much an American, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Could not compete with it. So nobody wanted anything to do with it. And so Harper makes a choice. He decides, you know what? Then I guess we'll try for Broadway. And the other decision that he made was, we're going to go back to that original story. First of all, because it's in the public domain, right? We don't have to pay for the rights, right? If I'm going to adapt the 1939 MGM film, I'm going to have to pay somebody for that, right? But if I go back to The Wizard of Oz from 1900, which was released in 1956 into the public domain, then I've got a lot more leeway of things to play with. And so he decides to jump onto that as his source material, and that's what he does. And he aims to take it to Broadway. Now, here's where he gets his money. He goes to 20th Century Fox. And it was MGM that had done the film in 1939, remember? So he goes to 20th Century Fox, a rival movie studio, and he promises them film rights. He said, whatever comes of this, you get recording rights, meaning whatever music is produced, you get the film rights from whatever subsequent films are made of, this Broadway show that I'm about to create. And they agreed. They gave him about $650,000 toward the capitalization of his show. Now,
which is a lot of money then.
Well, I'm going to convert that. That's about $4 million today, just under $4 million in 2025.
Which is...
You couldn't produce anything on Broadway today for that much. But back then it was... Yeah, right. You can do a workshop. You can do a reading, but that's about as far as you're going to get until you get more money. But that was
and it
all
hasn't
it
even
took.
Been created yet.
Right. Hasn't been created, and they give him the money. So then after he gets his money, he goes about assembling his team. He calls his Avengers, and he starts, ironically, because he's wanting to tell, he wants to take a white story and flip it on its head and try to see it from a black perspective. So he makes a really unusual choice. And I have never come across any rationale for why he went with this writer, but he went with the white librettist named William F. Brown.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me. I don't know much about William F. Brown, except that He'd had one show on Broadway. It was called The Girl in the Freudian Slip. It ran for 4 performances in 1967. So I don't know why he would, maybe they had a relationship outside. I don't know. I don't know. Do you know?
I was wondering the same thing researching this. I was like, where is this guy coming from? Because there's really very little that I could find on him.
Yes.
And I was like, it's weird. And he doesn't seem to, like, it seems to me that subsequently, when they go back and look at the show, they bring in other writers. So he's
That's right.
It's not like he's part of it still. Like, he's part of that team. It does seem very weird.
Yeah, he goes to a white writer and asks him to write The Wizard of Oz in a black idiom.
And everybody else is, like, the whole creative team.
Yes.
Is African American.
Totally.
Like, he does a beautiful job of finding tons of people, even if they weren't on Broadway, but finding the right people for this music. I mean, he did a really great job of that.
Yeah.
But it's just this random white guy.
I will keep digging, but I have not found anything that it would be one thing if he was like, oh, well, he's a sure thing. You get him on your side. If he were Hal Prince, or George Abbott, like, then it would make sense to me. But this guy who'd had one show on Broadway that ran for 4 performances, I don't get it. So they must have been friendly outside of the context. I don't know.
20th Century Fox say,
well,
you have to have X, Y, and Z.
That very well could have been it. Yes.
That was, when I was reading it, I was like, okay, is this some sort of weird monkeying of
it? Absolutely could be. That's a great point. That's a great point. But it would, that certainly, we know that happened.
Oh, we know that happens all the time, but where is he at that point? Had he gone to Hollywood, so they attached him to, who knows?
I don't know.
If you have information on this,
yes, email hello@drbroadway.com,
because we would really like to know. So I was like, where does this random guy come from?
Yes. So what Tracey, though, I do want to step back and elaborate on something that she said. She said maybe the studio said they had to have him. And what she means by that is maybe the studio made it a condition of, we're going to give you $650,000 to make this musical on the condition that you have a white creator as part of the team. Mm-hmm. That very possibly could be it. Yeah. But that does beg the question, well, who was William F. Brown that 20th Century Fox was picking him to be the guy?
Also, it doesn't have to be because he was white either. It could
be another reason. Yeah.
You have to use one of our staff.
Where he was under contract or whatever.
He was like one of those ones that were under contract at 20th Century Fox. Is like, but we need you to use one of our writers. It needs to be the primary kind of writer for it. And it may have been that he was looking at the writers they had available, and this was the only one with any Broadway experience.
Yeah.
So
it very possibly could be.
Yeah. It doesn't have to, obviously, it doesn't have to be racial in nature. It could have been something like that, too. But it was still just like, huh?
Yeah.
It was just
That's
so
a great
weird.
Point.
And you don't see any pictures of him.
No.
Like, you don't see any, like, info about him, like, even in the press. I don't know if you ran into any. I didn't run anything in the press. I'm just and he's gone. He's like this mystery that's gone. And that is so weird.
Yeah,
in this particular moment, the more time I spend looking at musicals that are like black musicals on Broadway that are written by white, there's so much information on what was happening in the middle, the conversation that's happening, and there is nothing there on this one. So,
well, and interestingly, and we'll get to this in a minute, of the creative team, he's the only one that didn't win a Tony. So that's interesting too. How about that, huh? Okay, so we've got William F. Brown, for reasons neither Tracey nor I understand, who's brought in as the librettist, but we are open to your suggestions. So like she said, send them to hello@drbroadway.com if you would, please. Then the next member of the team is Charlie Smalls, who's brought in as the songwriter. He both writes the music and lyrics for The Wiz. Now, Charlie Smalls was a prodigy who began playing the piano at a very, very early age. And attended the High School of Performing Arts in New York, which of course is the alma mater of people like Lynn Nottage and Lonnie Price and Liza Minnelli and Eartha Kitt and Priscilla Lopez and Charles Busch and Cy Coleman and Mitch Lee and lots of that's a really good pedigree, right, for a musical theater creator to come from the High School of Performing Arts, which is now LaGuardia, known as LaGuardia. So he then went to Juilliard. I love this. He also joined the armed forces where he played the glockenspiel.
The glockenspiel.
He was a glockenspielist or spieler, glockenspieler, probably in the Air Force Band. How about that? I did not know the Air Force Band employed a glockenspieler. Did you know this?
I did not.
It's interesting, right?
Just the glockenspiel.
Well, I mean, he probably dabbled in the piano as well, but his bread and butter was the glockenspiel.
I love
it. In fact, he wrote a song for the president's daughter. I read an article about that on the glockenspiel. So, you know, you got to have a gimmick, right? You got to have a gimmick.
What branch of the armed services was he in?
Air Force Band.
So it's not like he's in the Marines in the president's own, and the reason he's doing the glockenspiel is because they march with the cute little puppy out in front of them, right? No, like, okay.
No.
Air Force. I know.
Next time you see the Air Force Band performing, look for the glockenspiel.
I'm going to.
And remember Charlie Smalls, because he was there once upon a time. Okay, so then after his tour, he then toured with the New York Jazz Repertory Company. And then very early, he was only 31 years old when he was brought in to write the music for The Wiz. And when he was given his instructions from Kenneth Harper, the producer, he was like, here's what I want. Now, remember, Kenneth Harper had been a DJ for decades at this point. And Kenneth Harper's instructions were, I want this music to be a hit on any Black radio station, right? Like, he wanted it to be contemporary. And he was convinced that Charlie Smalls had the pedigree to pull that off. So Gilbert Moses is brought in as director. And we're going to get in more into the director thing here in just a minute. Yeah. And then George Faison is brought in as choreographer. He had been a dancer in the 1970 musical adaptation Purlie, which was an adaptation of Ossie Davis's 1961 play about a traveling preacher in Georgia called Purlie Victorious, which was just recently revived on Broadway with Leslie Odom Jr. in the title role. So Purlie, a musicalized version of that Purlie Victorious, had played Broadway in 1970, and the choreographer of The Wiz, George Faison, had been a dancer in that. He had been choreographing. He had been choreographing ever since, but he just done another, one or two shows. So again, this is a very novice creative team. And then Jeffrey Holder does the costumes. Now, Jeffrey Holder, as soon as I saw his picture, I immediately recognized Jeffrey Holder as Punjab from the 1982 John Huston version of Annie.
Yes.
My favorite.
Everybody loves
So if you are a child if you are a Gen Xer of the late 1970s, early 1980s, like I am, then you too will recognize the name Punjab.
A child without courage is like a night without stars.
Bingo.
Everybody trusts Punjab.
I still would trust him with my life. So Jeffrey Holder, though, let me tell you a little bit more about Jeffrey Holder. So Jeffrey Holder is from Trinidad. That accent that he used as Punjab was not put on. That was, in fact, how he spoke as a native of Trinidad. He had had his Broadway debut in 1954 for a Truman Capote show. And he'd been in a few shows on Broadway since then. He'd done a couple of James Bond films. He'd married actress, dancer, choreographer, beauty, Carmen de Lavalade, and they had a very long-standing love affair, which there's lots to be read about. It's beautiful to read about their relationship. But nevertheless, he designed the costumes for this musical. And he ended up doing more that we'll get to in just a minute. So with the creative team assembled, everything's getting written, everything's getting designed. They decide that they're going to try this out of town. And so they do. This is pre-Chorus Line, right? It's right around the same time, although it does predate Chorus Line by maybe 8 months. And in fact, it premieres on Broadway in January of 1975, which is about the time that those dancers who ended up coming up with the Chorus Line are first starting to meet. So the reason I bring that up is because a Chorus Line was really the first major show to use the workshop method, right? To not do the out of town thing. So the Wiz pre Chorus Line is still doing the traditional, we open in Venice, we then
Venice.
play, they open in Baltimore in this case. So they did a 3 or 4 city tour before premiering on Broadway. Now, while they were trying out of town, Harper was asked why it was all black, why he went with an all black company, except for William F. Brown.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nobody seemed to bring that up. I wish they would have. I would love to know Harper's thinking. But at any rate, he made some really great points that I thought would be great to include here. One was he thought that having an all black company was a really fail-proof way to ensure that it wasn't compared to the Judy Garland original, right? Which makes perfect sense. He said we could have done it with an all-Japanese cast, right? It was just, we needed it to be distinct from 1939 Judy Garland because that's not what we were trying to replicate. And then the second point that he made, and I thought this one was really, really strong, he said he wanted to avoid what he called racial polemics. He told a reporter for the Miami Herald, you can imagine what reaction we might get if we had a mixed race cast with a black witch and a white Dorothy or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And I thought that'll talk, right? That'll preach right there. So I thought that his rationale was outstanding and made perfect sense. So he, when pushed and say, why is this all black? Why isn't it mixed race? Why isn't it this race? Why isn't it that race? Those were his reasons, and I thought those were very solid and worth sharing. A couple of cast members in that original company that I want to be sure that we spotlight are Andre DeShields, who was about 30 years old when he played the Wiz. How about that? Another, Felicia Ayers-Allen, who became Felicia Rashad, was a Munchkin, a field mouse, and later an Emerald City citizen in her second role on Broadway. How about that? And then finally, Butterfly McQueen, who had played Prissy in Gone with the Wind, then again, another 1939 movie, iconic movie. She was a standby for the character of Ada Pearl. Am I saying that right? I don't remember that character from the show, so I'm not sure if I'm saying.
No, it's because it got cut.
Okay, well, there we go. That's why. Well, at any rate, she was in the original company. Yeah. Yes, in that one role.
Got cut. I think that's
okay.
what I was
well,
like,
that would explain it. That would explain it. They had talked about her potentially playing, the witch or another role, but ended up in this one.
It wasn't working.
Yeah. So as they go about their pre-Broadway tour, which, like I said, launched in October of 1974 in Baltimore, the reviews were not great. They were constantly, Harper had closing notices ready. I mean, it was costing way more to produce each week than they were bringing in. People were just not familiar with the title, although it seems like it would have been easy to connect the dots in your brain when you hear the Wiz, but people didn't. And it was a brand new entity, brand new creators. This is not, doesn't have a Rodgers or Hammerstein attached to it. It was brand new. And so in desperation, before posting the closing notices, Harper, not Holder. Harper decides that he's going to bring in Jeffrey Holder, who had, remember, designed the costumes, and he's going to let him direct. So all of a sudden, Gilbert Moses, who had done all of this work leading up to the out-of-town tryouts, he is pushed out, and in comes Jeffrey Holder. He comes in when they're in Detroit. So they went Baltimore to Detroit, and he's brought in Detroit and does, if you ask Holder, if you read, and there is a really beautiful interview with him in the New York Times, he would want you to think that he redid it from the ground up. However, in rebuttal to that, Gilbert Moses, who had been the director, wrote in and said, that ain't true. I did all that. He changed a few things. Yeah. And I'm more inclined to believe Moses. And that's but I don't know.
Usually what happens.
Yeah, exactly.
When you get a director that's replaced, if you look at the it happens all the time, right?
Right.
But it usually is that the director beforehand did a lot of the heavy lifting and couldn't get it across the finish line because they couldn't see what needed to be seen, or there was a breakdown between them and some of the other creatives or whatever.
And that's what Moses
and that kind of
said.
Stuff happens. That happens all the time. And it's sad because then it's like somebody whose life's work basically is in this, like, has their fingerprints all over it. It's like, oh no, they didn't do anything. And I'm like, really?
Right. And that's what he said. He said it fell apart because of relationships and management, but
look at
basically he didn't change that much. What's that?
Spider-Man.
Right.
Julie Taymor. Yes. Still, did they settle that lawsuit? I don't know if they did.
I don't know if it's over yet or not.
But that kind of stuff does happen a lot. And usually the idea that he brought somebody in from the creative team, not somebody from outside. It was literally just that everybody knew what changes to be made, and they couldn't get him to make it.
Yeah.
And they were like, we need to do this, this, and this, and then then it's fine. And then that's what's going to make it work,
Exactly. Exactly. So he is, Gilbert Moses is replaced as director in Detroit. The show then moves on to New York. Reviews are not great, like I said, and people are, as they'd been on the road, they don't know the show. They don't know what to expect from it. They don't know anybody on the creative team. So it opens in New York, bleeding money. Harper's ready to post the closing notice on opening night. But enter 20th Century Fox. Now, 20th Century Fox has already put up $650,000. And what they decide to do is really revolutionary. Now, it's not the first time this has happened, but it is very early in the use of television commercials on Broadway. So Fox says, don't close yet. We're going to give you another $120,000, which almost another $1 million in modern money, modern equivalent of almost another $1 million. And they produce a TV ad and they run TV ads. Now, this had not really been done hardly at all. Pippin is most generally acknowledged as the first to use actual show footage in a commercial. And this happened in 1972. So we're just 3 years removed because The Wiz premiered on Broadway in January of 1975. And interestingly, I want to point this out. It was at the Majestic Theater where that 1903 and 1904, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz had run for 500 collective performances. So, this story returns to its home at the Majestic Theater. But Pippin had done this in 1972. Pippin was similar. It was a, quote unquote concept musical, which was very new in the early 1970s. And it had an unknown story. Even still, when people ask me what Pippin is about, I've seen Pippin, I know Pippin, and I'm still like, well, Charlemagne. And, it's still very hard to describe. So at that point, audiences were like, I'm not buying a ticket to that. Why would I buy a ticket to that? So in response, Bob Fosse, choreographer extraordinaire, director of Pippin, says, you know what? I'm going to do a 60-second dance segment for Ben Vereen, who was the leading player in Pippin, and two other dancers. And then this will be the commercial, them dancing this moment from the show, 60 seconds from the show. And at the end of the commercial is this line: you can see the other 119 minutes of Pippin live at the Imperial Theater without commercial interruption. Yeah. Well, after that, the show runs for almost 2,000 performances. So truly, they can point to that ad campaign as saving the show. Well, 20th Century Fox says, why don't we try that with The Wiz? And so they did. They did an advertising blitz. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just think it's funny because if you look at the interviews from the current Wiz running, it's not running on Broadway right now, but that's about to start touring. That's what the director says too. It's like that commercial, like we wouldn't be doing this if not for that commercial.
Exactly.
And they showed kind of clips. You can go see it on YouTube.
In fact, I've got it to put on Dr. Broadway Podcast, at Dr. Bway Podcast on Instagram and TikTok. So stay tuned.
There are some moments that are very provocative. Mm-hmm. It's not like, the four characters that singing, Ease on Down the Road. That's not what they filmed. And what they filmed was just so... it was very provocative. And I remember, when I saw it the first time, I was like, whoa. We put that up? Because, I guess it wasn't that way till the 80s, but it's like, I remember watching TV, and I don't remember my parents screening the commercials, But
No.
I know my parents now, and if they were watching that commercial, they would cover like the 5-year-old grandkid's eyes. There would have been those moments where it was like, oh,
Right.
what is she doing?
Right.
You know,
Right.
and it's like,
Right.
It's very
What was the
anyway,
70s? What can I say?
The 70s. I'm like, I was born in the 70s, but
Yeah. Right. So, very interestingly, that had not been done prior to this. You would have just closed the show and said, oh, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Right. But now we have this new technology of commercials, and using actual footage from the show to advertise the show. And it works just as it had worked for Pippin in 1972. It works for The Wiz. The show becomes a huge hit. Those commercials changed everything. The show runs for nearly 5 years. Like I mentioned, it wins 7 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, which is why it's on this list. Tony's on tour. Won Best Musical, Best Score for Charlie Smalls, Best Featured Actor for Ted Ross, who was the Lion, Best Featured Actress for Dee Dee Bridgewater, who was Glinda, Best Costume Design for Jeffrey Holder, Best Choreography for George Faison, and Best Direction again for Jeffrey Holder. So Gilbert Moses did not get credit for the work that he put in there, but Jeffrey Holder did get credit for the save, to use a baseball term. So after the show, becomes a hit on Broadway, of course, it goes on multiple tours. And then in 1978, we have the film that I'm not going to say a whole lot about because there's been a lot of ink spilled on it that is accessible pretty easily if you want to look it up. But this is interesting about it. Harper, remember the producer, the guy who came up with the idea for The Wiz, he bought the rights back from 20th Century Fox and he sold them to Universal. So I love the fact that he was able to make a little money, right, on his story. I love that for him. And then Universal made the movie, which premiered in 1978. Very famously starred Diana Ross as Dorothy. Many people said, I think she was like 33 at the time. Many people said she has no business playing a 15-year-old or 14-year-old or whatever Dorothy was. She insisted on playing the role. And then, of course, Michael Jackson, in his one and only big starring role in a film, he played the Scarecrow. Yeah. This film is a huge flop, right? I think that it cost about $24 million to make it. It only made about $21 million in the box office.
Well, and they changed it pretty significantly.
Yes. The setting was totally changed. It's set in New York City. It's very different.
And it's just trying to do something completely different than the original musical was.
Yeah.
And I want us to say, like, when you put something on film like that, it can be kind of a catch-22 because it's like, ooh, I can really kind of put my stamp on this. I mean, there are good ideas, artistic ideas behind what they did, but if that's your first entry into understanding what The Wiz is about, you may alienate people.
Right.
If it's not, if it doesn't work, and you have to be ready for that. And I think, I spent a huge part of my life. I think better of it now, but I had only ever seen the movie, and because obviously they weren't touring.
No.
The Wiz around very often, and it wasn't really like done in the regional theaters that often. That was all I had of it. So it's like I really liked Ease On Down the Road, but everything else, it felt very inaccessible, and in some ways it was meant to be that way for me,
right?
But I was. It's sad because this is such a like really amazing moment on Broadway, and it just kind of I don't know, it's rough.
Yeah, no question.
It's a rough movie, and I think everybody thinks that is fine.
But in spite of that, it did become a cult classic. Like it was one of those early VHS tapes. Like I was watching Annie and the Sound of Music. The Wiz was out there, and a lot of people were watching it. So we
watched it this last week.
Did you really?
Yeah, I put it back on, and I was like, just so I remember what this. And I was like, this is weird.
Yeah,
there's a lot of me being like. Well, and then it was like, then why is the music completely different again? And then it's just like, I don't know. And some of that was, I'm glad I did it because it was me kind of having to reassess my attitude towards it. Because the first time I watched it, I was like, this is odd.
Right.
And
Right.
going,
Yeah.
what you're trying to do here, okay, now with a clear vision, I can see what you're trying to do. However,
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
not working.
Right. Right.
So,
Right. Well, it wasn't the movie-going audience's game either in 1978, to say the least. But at any rate, so that is 1978. The show closes on Broadway in January of 1979 after 1,672 performances. So that puts it still in the top 50 of longest running musicals. Just barely. It's number 49, but nevertheless, that's pretty rare air, right? Especially for a show that almost closed on the road and was saved by an ad campaign, right?
And it hasn't engendered like tour after tour after tour after tour,
right?
You know, and main place on our stages, you know, throughout the United States. It is a very it's one of those ones that you go, huh, really?
Right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, but like I mentioned, while it was running on Broadway, there were multiple tours going across the US. There were international tours. Mm-hmm. And at one of those US tours, a little 7-year-old girl from Dayton, Ohio, sat in a performance, and her name was Shelley Williams. Now, when she saw this show, it was absolutely life-changing for her as a little Black girl in Ohio who said, you know, I'd known that story, I'd seen that film, but it was not about me, right? And to see these characters who looked like her, suddenly she could see herself in that movie, and it was completely life-changing. So in high school, she got a chance to play Dorothy in The Wiz. She had always been a drummer. Her dad, in fact, was a professional drummer, and she had scholarships to college to play the drums. But her senior year in college, she decided rather than playing in the orchestra pit, as she typically would have done, she auditioned to be on stage in this production of The Wiz in Ohio. And she got the role of Dorothy. Well, again, talk about life-changing. She decided, I'm not going to play the drums. I'm not taking that drum scholarship to college. Instead, I'm going to take a scholarship and go to school to be an actor, right? Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what she did. She ended up becoming an actor. She had played on Broadway in a replacement cast of Rent. She was in Disney's Aida on Broadway. And then she became the associate director of Motown the Musical, which told the story, of course, of Motown, very famously written by Berry Gordy, who was the founder and president of Motown Records. So not long after Motown, as she is beginning to, you know, decide, I think directing is kind of the route that I want to go, she gets a call asking if she'd have any interest in directing a revival of The Wiz. Now, the people calling and asking her had no idea about how The Wiz had been such an inciting point for her for the career that she had lived ever since, right? Yeah. And so she immediately jumped at the opportunity. The plan was that there would be a 13-city tour that would go from 2023 into early 2024, and then a limited Broadway engagement in the summer of 2024 before hitting the road again in the winter of 2025, which is where we are in time now. And so she jumps at it. That tour starts in Baltimore, just as it had started in Baltimore in 1974. But before they got on the road, she had a vision, and she knew that there were some things about the show that needed to change. Most importantly, she needed to figure out the relevance of this story, which has been told since 1900. She needed to figure out what is the relevance of this story for this generation. She was thinking particularly of her two daughters, who were, you know, and how can this story reach them and their peers? But she also knew, right, exactly,
she started doing this.
That's right.
I remember watching her say, like, this is really, really, it's like, it comes full circle from me being a 7-year-old
100%, yes.
And going, what do they need to, like, exactly. How are they going to find themselves in this story? This is really amazing.
Yes, exactly. But she also, as we spent so much time under the conundrum of William F. Brown, she knew that she needed an updated libretto. And she knew she needed the voice of a Black writer to write in a Black idiom, right? which only makes sense. So she brought in comedian, podcaster, Amber Ruffin, librettist. Amber Ruffin comes in. She also writes for Seth Meyers, who has a late night TV show. And so Amber Ruffin comes in. She had kind of had a very similar experience with The Wiz. She'd grown up in Nebraska watching the film, and it had been so impactful on her life as a child and had stuck with her throughout her life. And so she had very specific things that she wanted to say through her kind of revision of Brown's book. And so she did it. And just a couple of tidbits about this latest production. One, there's no Toto. So Toto is, a really big character in the books and the films, and Toto doesn't show up in this version of The Wiz. And the reason for that is they wanted to push Dorothy out of her comfort zone, right? They wanted the stakes to be raised. So suddenly, if she doesn't have Toto as her little pal, then she would need to have something that could comfort her. She would have to really latch on to her new friends that she made on her way, right? And so that was a very specific decision that they made. Another one was the sets were designed by Hannah Beachler, who lives in New Orleans. And she based Oz in this new telling of The Wiz on a historically Black neighborhood in New Orleans. So if you're familiar with New Orleans, you spent a lot of time in Louisiana, look for that because you may recognize that. And then, like I said, it went on a 13 city tour, and premiered on Broadway in the early summer 2024, ran throughout the summer to very robust houses, went almost 100% all summer long. It was a limited engagement, closed as planned August of 2024, and then it's just hitting the road again here in February of 2025. And I'm sure it will go on to delight audiences all across the globe. So there you have The Wiz, where it came from. Tracey, what more can you tell me?
Well, I want to take a step back and just add one more thing to your conversation about how things have kind of changed. Watching the interviews with Shelley Williams, one of the things that she says that she wanted to change really quickly was kind of the relationship between the Tin Man and the Tin Man, Lion, and Scarecrow. I was like, what's the other one?
I was trying to help you, but my brain wasn't getting there fast enough.
I know, and Dorothy. And I thought this was a really, really interesting way of doing it. I mean, her talking so openly about the fact that it's like, what do my daughters need to see in this? It's making sure that stereotypes can't be read in to what we're seeing. Like, if we have to make a change to pull it apart from that stereotype, then maybe we need to do that. One of the things that she does is she puts and tries to make sure all four characters are the same age. And she's like, I did that on purpose because often when you see this, you have this little girl and her three uncles. And it's like, these are the people, these are the adults in your life. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. Because then all of a sudden, these are four people who are having to work through their own issues, and they're having to kind of work to become something else rather than, it all focused just on Dorothy, being the person that changes. Even if that's kind of the way it's written, it doesn't have kind of the connotation of like wanting something better for the next generation, because the older generation, they're a mess kind of a thing. And I was like, I thought that was a really, really interesting point. Anyway, yes, I thought that was great. There was one other thing that we found that I think actually you found and sent to me, was a New York Times article written just after The Wiz comes out, and it could have been written today. It was entitled Blacks Gain on Broadway, but they lag in two other art forms, and it just kind of laments the fact that there's so much talent there, but there is no access.
Right.
And then talks about the fact that once the access has been opened, there's not talent to... It was an interesting kind of article that could have been written today. What I walked away from it is that we just really haven't solved, as a society, we haven't really talked about it, and we haven't solved the issue of kind of like, what we want to see is equality on Broadway, and what we want is to make sure that everybody sees themselves on stage. It takes sacrifices in lots of different places.
Right.
And that's why I just, I think that's what struck me more than anything this week, was doing this research and going, I'm hearing the same thing from African-American activists and white allies today that they were saying in 1975. And I think that says something very, very, very powerful about our society today.
Well, it's like you were saying, where we had, progress and then it goes away, right? It seems to be cyclical. And to that point, I want to say, and this really drives home the point of the New York Times article, although it was written in 1975 before this would have been true, but nevertheless, it looks forward to what I'm about to say, which is that in the decade of the 1970s, 3 of the best musical Tony Award winners were Black musicals, which is amazing, right? So there was Raisin in 1973, The Wiz in 1975, and then Ain't Misbehavin', which was a Fats Waller review kind of show, in 1978. 3 in a decade.
And then, poof.
Not much, right? I mean, but that speaks to the point that you made as you were contextualizing at the beginning, where you were saying, we would have progress and then it would go away, and then it would happen again and then it would go away, right? This kind of cycle.
Yeah. I think that's indicative of our society.
Right. No question.
What do I tell people all the time? History is cyclical. And history is cyclical because, the time period changes, technology changes, society and culture change versus like their likes and likes. You want to know what doesn't change? People and their hearts. And their greed. People don't change. And because human beings, we are pretty predictable. And because of that, you can read history pretty well. I think you're right in kind of looking at this kind of cyclical, okay, we're okay with this, and now we're not. No, we're okay.
Right.
We're okay, and now we're not. And now we're not. And now we're going to do this. And now we're going to do that.
It's just the pendulum. I mean, it's the pendulum of, we can make a lot of change or progress, and then we got to go back, right? Then we have to course correct. And then it is a pendulum, which is why, as we begin to see, after Hair, we see all of these concept musicals pop up and all this, rock operas and blah, blah, blah. But we also see the beginning of revivals and these very nostalgic review shows of music from the 20s and 30s, because it's a pendulum,
that moves back.
And that was happening at the same time that these musicals are being produced in the 70s.
So I'm a former student who was actually cast in The Wiz on Broadway and did the whole the tour ahead of time, and did I think 3/4 of the run on Broadway before she got pulled to do Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil in Chicago for their pre-Broadway before she got pulled. Yeah. And my hope for her, just like my hope for The Wiz at this point, is that, we can continue to realize that representation matters, and that there are little 7-year-old girls out there sitting in those seats that need to see this.
No question.
But just like there are 7-year-old girls who are African-American who need to see this, my girls need to see this too. My girls need to realize that their experience is not... they need to be able to kind of live in both experiences, I think. So they have to be able to look at Dorothy's experience and say, look at what she's faced with. Right. Look at this and how she stands up and grows through it. I want to be like that.
Right.
I want my little girls to have that kind of role model. Like, they need to see themselves too. They need to see themselves standing up and helping. So
yes, yeah, agreed.
It's hard.
And the Wiz is an outstanding vehicle for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when we'll be talking about the 1977 production of Annie. I can't wait.
Yay.
Until then, yes, I can't wait. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at Dr. Bway Podcast.